In Donald Trump's second term, the Supreme Court is at the very heart of American politics. It is making decisions that affect his ability to do what he wants to do. And so far, it is fair to say that it generally finds in favor of the White House.
But the Supreme Court handed the Trump administration 2 victories today in cases involving DOJ, including giving it access to Social Security systems containing personal data on millions of Americans.
And the Supreme Court's allowing the Trump administration to slash hundreds of millions of dollars in research funding in its push to cut federal diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts.
Late yesterday, we got another decision. They went ahead and agreed with President Trump having the authority to terminate 2 appointees on behalf of President Joe Biden. And the reaction I was picking up online when this decision came across is that they were surprised that they allowed this to happen.
So here's the question. Is the Supreme Court at any stage going to stand up to Donald Trump, or is it simply in the business of expanding his power? Welcome to Americast.
Americast from BBC News.
And we're going to focus today on the Supreme Court. It is hugely, hugely important, and never more so when there is a president who is keen on doing things and stretching the limits of his own power. So a lot of people interested in this, and a lot of Americasters have written to us and asked us to take an interest in it. Just an example, Anthony, if I could kick it off with Ed Stranger, who's written from London and asked this. I'm writing to request more discussion and analysis around the potential impact of the Supreme Court in impacting the Trump administration's agenda in coming years. This body surely has to start having a say in all manner of the administration's policies, and some in-depth analysis of this currently silent branch of government would be interesting to hear. Reasonable points, Anthony.
Absolutely. We have heard the Supreme Court have some say. They have started to have a say in that montage you played there. The Supreme Court has weighed in on a lot of these big issues involving Trump and executive power, but only tentatively so. A lot of those headlines you heard were the Supreme Court deciding not to step in and stop Trump's policies from going into effect. They didn't definitively say whether those were legal or not, whether Trump could do them or not. And so there are these cases that are still out there now that we're waiting on in the coming months that are going to say exactly how much power Trump has on things like immigration, on things like presidential appointments, and perhaps most importantly, on Donald Trump's massive expansion of presidential power in the subject of trade and imposing tariffs on foreign nations. So those are still yet to be definitively decided. And when we say definitively decided, as you point out, Justin, the Supreme Court, when they issue a decision, there's no appeal. It's final. They are the ones who pass judgment on whether laws are constitutional, whether laws are being properly applied. And these 9 justices, if 5 of them agree, that is the final word on the matter.
Yeah, 9 justices, Anthony, but of course a big conservative majority at the moment, which has not always been the case, but is the case at the moment, including Supreme Court justices that Donald Trump himself has appointed. And that leads people to wonder about the not just the fairness of the Supreme Court, but also in a sense its legitimacy, and particularly Democrats who are hacked off about various decisions that have been made. And I suppose the big one, the end of Roe versus Wade, have this sense that the Supreme Court is now the enemy. It's fair to say, isn't it, that the Supreme Court and discussions about the Supreme Court, never mind what they do about the Trump administration's various efforts to do various things, the Supreme Court is in a sense in play in American politics in a way that hasn't been for a bit.
I think maybe going back a few decades, most people didn't give a whole lot of thought to the Supreme Court. They probably couldn't pick a justice out walking down the street or standing in line next to them in the grocery store, if Supreme Court justices do go grocery shopping or they have someone do it for them. But they were relatively anonymous. Obviously, people who pay attention to the big cases do know that the Supreme Court has power, but it was always the least understood branch of the federal government. That has changed, as you rightly point out. This Supreme Court, with its 6-3 conservative majority, 3 of those conservative justices appointed by Donald Trump himself in his first term, they have in the past 5 or 6 years really dramatically reshaped the lay of the land as far as the law goes in this country. They have overturned precedents that had been established sometimes for half a century or more. Precedents, as you mentioned, on abortion, on racial preferences in higher education and how you could take that into account, on the power of federal agencies to issue regulations without court oversight, on all of these different environmental regulations, on gun control and handgun ownership rights. I mean, all of these things have been pretty stark in the way they have changed course in the past few years. And really, I think it's the most conservative Supreme Court that America has had in at least 75 years, and they are flexing their muscle time and time again.
And the other thing, and we'll talk about this with our guest, the former Supreme Court clerk, in just a second, is that in doing that, they are following a tradition, which is that the Supreme Court does change America. You think back to Brown versus the Board of Education, that decision back in the 1950s that, in a sense, pushed open the doors for the whole civil rights movement. And that was the court making a decision, wasn't it? A decision that changed America in one specific instance, the business of education being mixed and not separate as it had been, particularly in the South until then. But a wider situation as well, a wider sense of American change coming from the court. And I suppose you could say, couldn't you, that that's just what we're seeing now?
Right. There have been moments where the Supreme Court has stepped in and issued landmark decisions that really do set the framework for how Americans live. They affect our everyday lives. Brown versus Board of Education is a good one. Separate is inherently unequal, essentially ending racial segregation in American schools. If you go back on the flip side, something like Plessy v. Ferguson, which the Supreme Court decided in the 1850s that slaves were property and they didn't have any kind of rights and redress in the courts, that was an incredibly impactful Supreme Court decision. On the flip side, I mean, it led to essentially directly to the Civil War, and there have been decisions on things like abortion, on freedom of the press. New York Times v. Sullivan, protecting major newspapers from lawsuits when they're reporting. I mean, that was a landmark case. There are cases on access to birth control. There are cases involving individual liberties and right to protest. There are ones that protect individuals who have been arrested. You remember the Miranda case, which said that individuals had to be informed of their rights after they've been arrested. You can go through and see moments where the Supreme Court really has issued decisions that directly impact people's lives. There are other ones that maybe you don't feel quite as much that still have significant impact. One